The propaganda's a win, stress feeding on my tension. My countrymen, they love their fiction. Words upon now, it's made with good intentions.
Kia ora koutou, and welcome to a special edition of 1 of 200, the New Zealand's media and politics podcast. Today I'm joined by my co-host Josephine Varghese. How are you today?
Kia ora, I'm okay, given the circumstances, quite stressful to be alive in this time. But apart from that, I'm okay.
And our very special guest is Dr. Jeremy Moses, who is Associate Professor in International Relations and Political Studies, I believe, at Canterbury University. How are you doing,
Morning.
Jeremy?
Good afternoon, in fact. I think it is now.
Yes.
I'm doing well, thanks. Like Josephine, it's a stressful time to be alive, not just in terms of our own work, but in terms of having to think about what's happening in the world. But we're largely insulated from the very worst of the consequences of it here, so we are able to do those things and continue our lives. But yeah, so it's a strange time to be alive. There's no doubt about that.
Indeed, yes. We've had a fair bit of that sort of sentiment on 1 of 200 over the last 2.5 years, really. It felt a lot like we have a privileged bubble here, and it feels artificial and unreal. Yes, so now the purpose of this broadcast is to promote the upcoming rally on the April the 11th on Saturday, or upcoming rallies around the country, which are part of a National Day of Action, More War National Day of Action, which was an idea originated by Unionist and Socialist Joe Carolyn, has arranged it with John Minto, so PSNA is involved, but it's also part of the launching of what hopefully will be a movement, Stop Wars Aotearoa, so that we have a more of a presence going forward as these problems continue. So should we start with an update of what has been happening on the ground? Josephine, so what's been going on in West Asia, for example, to start there?
Yeah. All right. So just before I get into that, I'm going to say that this No Wars rally is going to be happening across various centers across the Motu in Christchurch. It's at 1 p.m. at the Bridge of Remembrance. And this coming Saturday, which is the 11th of April, in Auckland, it's on the same day at 2 p.m. in Aotea Square. And if you follow your PSNA, networks or your local union movement and anti-war movements, you'll get information about your local actions. So I just wanted to put that in.
And we'll remind you, we'll give you a roundup at the end of the three centres that have actions. But yes, do keep your eyes open, because people often have to throw these things together at the last minute, and your local organisation is hopefully going to throw something together. So keep your ear to the ground and all of that. Yes. So anyway, update.
Yeah, update. So contrary to our, general understanding that New Zealand is insulated from these issues, now New Zealanders are facing some of the impacts of this, unprovoked war against Iran. We are feeling it in our everyday lives. We are feeling it at the gas station. We're feeling it, as the cost of living crisis, which has been ongoing for quite a few years now, is getting worse. So it is a wake-up call to us that, in fact, we are not insulated, maybe physically insulated from some of these actual direct attacks and so forth, but not as far as the economy goes, not as far as, our communities go. Our community in New Zealand, comprises of people from across the world. These people have families in affected regions, so we are affected, and we can feel it now in our everyday expenses as well. And the people who are going to be affected the most, and already affected the most, are those on the margins of society, right? We have a growing inequality crisis in New Zealand. The bottom 50% of New Zealand own only 2% of the wealth. The top 50%, sorry, the top 10% own 70% of the wealth in this country. And this crisis is getting worse with the situation that's ongoing with the global a geopolitical crisis that we're seeing, which is a result of imperialism, US and Israeli imperial attacks in West Asia and elsewhere. So, yeah, we are getting affected. And the update is that, the war is ongoing. Trump is trying to pretend that he has a say on some of the things. He's trying to say that he has defeated Iran when in fact there's no sign of it. His statements are very much divorced from the reality. So we are seeing that every single day. I don't know, we're hearing these statements which in my view, are more catered towards the reaction in the stock market rather than anything to do with reality. So for the first time in our, we can see Trump getting slapped by the Iranian forces through their strategic response to the attacks, including the way that they're controlling the Strait of Hormuz, which is a key trade route for the international trade, especially for fuel. So yeah, that's ongoing. We're also seeing that Iran has witnessed over 1,600 strikes on their territory, and this was two days ago. So that number would have increased by now. I'm hearing around, is it 600 schools attacked, over 30 universities attacked as well. So it's an clear targeting of civilian infrastructure. We saw that unfinished bridge, which was a major project of the Iranian government, being destroyed, and Trump promising to, send Iran back to the Stone Age without understanding that actually Iran, which was a much bigger empire back in 650 BC. So sending them back there probably means increasing the power. Obviously, Trump doesn't have that historical perspective. But what it also shows is that the mask of this being a war to liberate Iranians, that mask is falling off. The idea that it was going to bring democracy and women's rights, they're not saying that anymore. They're saying that we're going to bomb them back to Stone Age, we're going to hit them hard, we're going to focus on civilian infrastructure like the power plants and so forth. It's actually revealing the true intent was never about development or liberation of the people in Iran. Rather, it is the geopolitical dominance that the United States and Israel is seeking. So that's my update from my side.
Now, Jeremy, of course, Josephine brought up many war crimes there, but also so these perhaps you could explain the difference between jus in bello and jus ad bellum, and maybe give us an idea of how this relates to what's going on and what maybe might be different, and what relates to past imperial practices by the US.
Yeah, those are big questions. I won't go into too much detail on those distinctions within, just war thinking or within the laws of war. I think not everyone, obviously, but most people are fairly comfortable with the idea that this was a war that was launched illegally, despite the fact that the United States and Israel and their hangers-on continue to try and sort of fudge that issue. That's usually what gets referred to in terms of jus ad bellum, which is having a just cause for waging war. That's been translated into international law, mainly through the rules in the UN Charter as to when it's legal to wage war. So that issue it still sits there. But most people, I think, accept that this is a war of aggression, which is supposedly what the United Nations system was supposed to be about preventing and restricting and punishing. An international criminal law developed post World War II in order to do those things as well. But then in terms of jus in bello, that's like justice in the fighting of war. That's where we have the Geneva Conventions and the rules about what is considered to be legal or illegal activity in the fighting of war, the waging of war itself. And again, there's a lot of attempt I've seen over recent days and weeks to kind of fudge this idea that, many legal experts believe that the bombing of bridges and electricity plants and schools and hospitals may be illegal. Like this is the way it tends to be reported in most of the Western media, where in actual fact, if it was any other country that was doing these things and threatening them, saying that they're going to do them in the way that the US and Israel have been doing, then that wouldn't be about consulting with legal experts. They would simply say, heinous war crimes are being committed on a daily basis, and that these insane political leaders are boasting about it constantly. So once again, I think there's all this hesitancy and nervousness amongst media and political leaders in New Zealand, in Australia, and in other parts of the world about actually describing this in the way that it needs to be described. But I also, you talked about the longer history. I do think that these are practices that have been developing over many decades now. And I've been thinking a lot about, and I always think a lot about the case of Kosovo in 1999, the NATO intervention to supposedly protect Kosovo's Albanian population against Serbian aggression, then under Slobodan Milosevic. And the way in which that proceeded is on a much smaller scale than this, but in a very similar kind of way. They start out and they say, well, this is in the interests of justice and defending human rights, and we have very limited range of bombing targets, and it's going to take a few days to achieve our objectives, and then it will be over. And then what you see happen over the course of that case in Kosovo in 1999 was this gradually increasing list of targets. You start to see more and more public infrastructure being targeted, media organizations being targeted, and it's all justified in terms of, well, they were connected in some way to the military or to the propaganda apparatus, or this train crossing the bridge, a commuter train, and I think 30 something people were killed, civilians, in the bombing of a commuter train that was about to cross a bridge in Serbia in 1999, and this was all justified in terms of humanitarianism. Now, Josephine said before that they've kind of dropped that humanitarian rhetoric. Well, actually, Trump in his press conference today said again that the Iranian people want this. They want their freedom. They're asking us to bomb more. Even people whose neighborhoods have been bombed are begging us to continue bombing, which is, it's crazy stuff. But the humanitarian bit is still sitting in there. It's still part of the story, even though no one really is convinced by it anymore. What I thought was also interesting today was Pete Hegseth was comparing the rescued pilot to Jesus. He talked about the death, he described it in terms of the death and resurrection of Christ. So we're in a real situation here, but it's one that is kind of just this sort of grotesque manifestation of things that have been developing and have been in place for a very long period of time.
So it's the same playbook we're seeing again and again in your research and your studies about international conflict over the years, Jeremy? And can you also speak a little bit about what's going on in Lebanon as well?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's a continuation of, again, decades of Israeli aggression against Lebanon. And we're seeing certainly a much more overt suggestion that Israel will occupy at least that section of southern Lebanon up to the Litani River. So it's about 30 kilometers away from the border with Israel. They want to permanently occupy that as what they describe as a buffer zone. And there have been calls from senior Israeli political leaders to use the Gaza method in southern Lebanon, which essentially means bomb everything, bulldoze everything into rubble, so it's impossible for people to return. Yeah, so we're starting to see now people reporting this. I can't remember what the outlet was. It might have been Zateo or one of those media organizations describing this as genocide against Shia Muslims but it's not even just against Shia Muslims. Like Christian villages are being attacked.
Yeah.
As much as anyone else. It's about clearing and eventually occupying and taking territory. It's naked imperialism in that regard. Some missteps, though, I think, on the part of the Israelis is they've managed to kill at least one, and I think two sort of prominent, I think one was a military figure and one religious figure from the Christian community associated with the Maronite community and the Lebanese forces, who have traditionally and still are very much think of themselves as allied with Israel because they hate Muslims more than they hate Israelis. So the Israelis have always exploited that sectarian divide. But if some of their people and their lands and their homes start getting affected by Israel's constant bombardment and expansion of its targeting lists to everywhere across the country, then that could potentially change the dynamics in Lebanon. But as far as I'm aware, that the Christian community associated with, the Maronite sect and with the Lebanese forces militia still consider themselves to be very much on the side of Israel. So it's a very strange political
Hmm.
dynamic.
Okay,
Yeah.
but at the same
Oh,
time,
sorry, I
the
just want to say, I think that with Lebanon, is a country that was set up by the French to exploit divisions between and increase divisions between communities by setting up a constitution that put them at odds with each other. We have now the Israelis saying to Druze and Christians, warning them, do not shelter Shia Muslims. So, we are. It's a grim, and it does seem particularly pointedly genocidal when they put it in those terms. Although I would also argue that the very nature of things like the Dahia doctrine and this idea of imposing a Gaza type solution are that they're inherently genocidal themselves, because genocide is effectively war against the people instead of against the military, and that this is part of US imperialism just as strongly, that they use military pretext to wage war against peoples and nations, and then that's part of what's been feeding into all of these wars, going back right to the Korean War. So yeah, and of course international humanitarian law, as it tries to enforce discrimination, is violated because there's a basic underlying genocidal purpose, so that they target civilian targets and civilian infrastructure because that serves their purposes, which are genocidal rather than legitimate military purposes. So, what would you think of that, Jeremy?
I think that there's a lot to be said for that. You could describe it just in terms of divide and rule type of politics, which is associated with colonialism and imperialism going in almost every case. That you find a community that is going to be useful to you, supportive of your objectives, and you, yeah, turn people against each other in order to prevent them from uniting against you and driving them out of your country, which is definitely the case in Lebanon. That's what's happened, and I think it's very unfortunate. And I think for my family on my dad's side is from the Christian Maronite community. I know many of my relatives continue to believe that Israel is the good force in the moment, which I just find completely bizarre. And I know that eventually, the longer that goes on, they'll lose their land and homes as well, and then they will have to realize that they made a mistake about that.
Hmm.
It's just odd to me that that hasn't happened already. But prejudice runs deep, and if you exploit it in that way over decades or centuries, then it's very hard to dislodge. I did want to
That,
say something about humanitarian law as well, but I'll let Josephine, I know you want to say something.
yeah, but I just also wanted to talk about, in this context, we're talking about divide and rule, but some of the most prominent names in the Palestinian and Lebanese resistance are actually Christian. It's like George Abdallah. There's many other examples. George Abdallah was imprisoned in France for like over 40 years and
Mm.
got released recently. And he was part of the, Palestinian resistance, but also the Lebanese resistance against the occupation of Lebanon by Israel. And also the resistance, I'm also hearing from, some reports from, for example, Breakthrough News and some other, grassroots independent media who say that actually there's a lot of support for Hezbollah, even among the Christian communities who are being attacked in the southern Lebanon. So I just wanted to ask you about that as well.
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, I think it's so easy to take on the idea that a political community is one thing, but we know from I know you want to come back to the Iranian example where we have people in the diaspora who have celebrated the US and Israeli invasion and are waving Israeli and American flags at protests, and Well, yeah, of course, there's different people and different groups benefit from politics. This shouldn't be a surprise to us. Different people within different groups have different ideas about justice and about what side they're going to fight on. So, yeah, I did say I still do think the majority in the Maronite community in Lebanon, for example, do still fairly steadfastly, though they certainly hate the Muslim population in Lebanon and see them as inferior and see the Israelis attacking them as a good thing. But of course, there are many people that I know from that community who don't hold that view, who have a very different idea about what is just and how we should respond to that. So yeah, I don't mean to generalize when I say those things, but there are those broad trends between those groups.
Yeah, yeah.
I'd like to contrast that, like, with the discourse of sectarian strife in Islam, for example, which is often actually more something made up to create an impression that isn't there as much. So yeah, it's definitely true that people are split in all sorts of ways. Divide and rule is an ancient tactic, and I think that we see the price that people pay for not standing in solidarity with each other. For example, I think, personally, I think that the Lebanese government are foolish to believe that if Hezbollah simply stopped resisting, then the Israelis would leave them alone. This is a nonsense. Israel is still going to go after them. And I think that the GCC countries are the same. They're led by people who think that they can avoid something that will come to get them eventually. So yeah, and I think this is also true of where we stand here. We are all connected, and solidarity doesn't end at a particular point. An injury to one is an injury to all, and I think we have to realize that and start fighting this fight all together throughout the world, because this is a global phenomenon.
Jeremy, you were gonna say talk about human rights.
Yeah, about humanitarianism and yeah, and the law and even the laws of war. I think that the two books that are published in the last 5 years, is it still 5 years, that I think really in different ways do a really good job of describing the material and the ideological dimensions of American empire. With Daniel Immerwahr's How to Hide an Empire, where he talks about the development of American empire and its current existence as a pointillist empire. That is, that it exists not as a big contiguous territory as we've thought of empires in the past, but as a series of points on the map. And we know that now that consists of, I think, just under 900 military bases in different, like spanning the entire globe. And so I think that's a really useful way of understanding where and how the US empire exists and why they've been able, but also why they've been able to deny its existence. So that idea of hiding the empire, that it was something that for a long, I think until very recently, people have been very reluctant to openly admit. It wasn't really until after the war on terrorism began, even well into that people started to
Yeah.
talk about American empire again. Prior to that, in the 1990s, it was still something that was considered almost taboo to use that kind of language in relation to America. So I think the way in which it exists, the materiality of American empire has enabled that. But the second one is Samuel Moyn's Humane, which is the subtitle of which is how the United States abandoned peace and reinvented war, I think. And he talks about the role of international humanitarian law in relation to American power and how they grew together through the 20th century, and then particularly at the point of the Vietnam War, where there's so much criticism of American actions in how they fought that war against the Vietnamese, that it ultimately led to a kind of reconciliation between international human rights and humanitarian law thinkers and practitioners and the US military, that from then on they in many ways worked in harmony to develop their practices, their discourse, their rules of engagement, to say, well, we always act in accordance with international humanitarian law, and that's what sets us apart. So we are the humane military. And then
Yeah.
you have the interventions in the 1990s, the humanitarian interventions. I think this has become people's way of thinking about the US, and I think it's a part of why our political leaders have been so, they're so reluctant and they find it so difficult to criticize this very sort of naked imperialist war making that we currently see, very religious as well, because we grew up in this environment in which the United States represented a force for good. That's how they promoted themselves. And so in that sense, people talk now about our political leaders being afraid to criticize the US because they think Trump's going to do something to them. I don't think it's that. I think this is they just don't know how to think of the United States military, the United States empire as being evil. They don't it doesn't correspond to the system in which they were raised. So when you have Luxon or Anthony Albanese or Penny Wong in Australia, like sort of struggling to or talk about the application of really obvious international legal principles to the US, I don't think it's because they're afraid of what's going to happen to them if they don't toe the line. I think that this is their belief system. This is
Mm.
like how they grew. And so humanitarian ideology is really central to excusing all of the excesses of American power. And I still think it is, even though it's less at the front of Trump's rhetoric or Hegseth. They're just all about, we're going to kill everyone and blow everything up. And they think that's awesome. So there's the
I
Marvel
think
sort of Marvel movie element to it as well. But there's always that like something good about us doing that at the same time.
I think this is actually a sign that they struggled to find the pretexts, the humanitarian pretexts. So they are. I mean, one of the great things about Trump is that he's the lightning rod. He's deniable. You know, I see a lot of people talking about Trump and Israel bombed Iran this morning. Trump and Israel bombed such and such. It's like they're actually blocking the existence of the United States out of their minds still. You know, I mean, the US has killed over 60 million people since the end of World War II, and we don't really talk about it as if that actually happened. And people really struggled to understand what was going on during the Vietnam War. They got there in the end, but and then I think when we talk about things like just war or responsibility to protect or even preemption, they're discursive creations, a bit like the ticking time bomb excuse for torture. They're theoretical creations about something abstract to use to cover acts that are completely unjustifiable in the real world.
That's
And
right.
I think that's one of the ways we've been conditioned not to see what the US is doing.
Mm. But it's also, I agree with you, Jeremy, that we are, raised and conditioned to think about the West, or, headed by the United States, but also all its allies as the good versus, it's rooted in Western supremacy, isn't it? It's very much rooted in the 400 years of colonial discourse that, the West is rational, logical, civilized, and the non-West is backward, primitive, savage, barbaric, all that stuff, irrational, emotional, corrupt, all that stuff, which Edward Said kind of pointed to in Orientalism, Samir Amin pointed to in Eurocentrism and in their theses. But at the same time, I also think that they know this double standard. And one good example is Mark Carney's speech, where he said, "We've always known that it's only a partial truth." What is a partial truth? It's either truth or it's false. And they knew that this narrative of international law, humanitarianism, all this thing was actually a lie. But they still went by it because it benefited them. And they said, like, basically the crux of that speech was, we don't mind this international order as long as we're sitting at the table with the imperial hegemon. But when the United States starts threatening Canada, which Trump did in the run up to their elections, which kind of overturned their election. There was a Trumpian candidate in Canada that was poised to win, and Trump's threats of making Canada the 51st state, and that it kind of had a massive impact of, and they voted for this technocrat, Mark Carney, who was a former chief of the Bank of England, typical neoliberal, technocratic prime minister they have there, and him admitting that we've known all along that it was a farce, but we still went by it because it benefited us. We want to be at the table, not on the menu, and that's what the crux of his thing was. As long as we're at the table, we're fine with it. And that's basically what I'm seeing with the rest of the, Western allies. And Penny Wong and Albanese and Luxon and David Seymour and that, they're not, I think it's not just, this idea of good versus evil. I do think that they truly believe that the West is morally superior. United States is morally superior to, countries in the global South, Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Pacific. But also, it's also linked to the material basis of these countries. These are, these are colonial and countries that still benefit from the exploitation and the extraction, a chief extraction of resources and labor from the global South. And, the ruling classes in these countries, the wealthy, they actually do benefit from the global imperial system, which is headed by the United States. And so a lot of it is also coming from that. And there's this fear that, the alternative, which is currently, the biggest threat that they see is China. And that represents a completely different system where the billionaire class doesn't really have the same amount of power. So it's actually in the existential interests of the Western billionaire class to, fight for the survival of this current global order, which is dominated by those 900 plus military bases around the world, which are there, which operate to enforce the will of, the shareholders of the massive industries headquartered in the United States and the West. So yeah, I think it's both of these things. On the one hand, there is that narrative, but it's also rooted in the material reality of imperialism and extraction from the global South.
Yeah, I think that's right. I have been thinking a lot about whether there is this knowing hypocrisy or not, because you mentioned Carney, and of course, a few weeks after he made that speech, where he very strongly said any decisions about war need to be going through the UN Security Council. A few weeks later, he was fine with the with the US and Israel attack on Iran, and so it's like, who are you? And like, are you aware of the fact that you are hypocritical? Is this hypocrisy at all? And the same with Israel, like saying, "Oh, war crimes are being committed against us. We're going to take this to the Security Council, the bombing of civilian areas in Israel, and they expect to be taken seriously about that." But I think, like you say, this has a long history in international law and in way in which international law supported colonialism, which was used to be, up until the 19th century, overtly premised upon the standard of civilization. That is the idea that the rules apply only in situations in which we decide that they should apply, and that was overt. And I think, sadly, that persists. So the racism that is inherent in that history of international law and the way in which it grew up with colonialism and in many ways as justification for colonialism obviously still functions today. So the question then is, well, is it hypocrisy, or is this just the belief? This is the belief system of these people. They genuinely think that the law should only apply to protect them, and should also apply to enable them to do whatever they want to the people who are considered to be of lesser value than themselves. I think that that's still much more prevalent today than people would like to admit. And yeah, we're seeing that pretty clearly, I think, in a way.
Yep.
So it's
I would
part of the
like
design.
to agree with that. I mean, I think with people like we're talking about people like Luxon and Seymour and stuff, I think to some extent we are in a fascist moment where it simply is Western chauvinism and racism, and they no longer believe that there is some sort of moral superiority or that they are doing this for the benefit of the benighted other peoples of the world. they understand this as a clash of civilizations, that sort of war of us against them, and they're following that through because the liberal pretext, the liberal discourse is fallen apart. The pretense of benevolence, the pretense of Western benevolence is cracking, and the fascist reality beneath the mask is being revealed.
Yeah, absolutely. And just another update for the listeners is that new law that was passed in the Israeli Knesset, the parliament, which is, a hallmark of apartheid, having separate a death penalty that basically applies only to Palestinians. Again, a mask-off moment for Israeli apartheid regime. Yeah, absolutely. Any comments on that?
Oh, well, another mask off moment in in a litany of others. I mean, it's not, yeah, it's appalling and horrifying to see that and to see the sort of celebratory things that go on in the aftermath of it. This is a state that where it's supposed to be supportive of for some, and if you criticize this state, then we all know what happens then. So yeah, I mean it's embarrassing, it's shameful that again, although I come back to this thing I've been thinking about, is this a lack of courage? Is it because people fear being punished if they criticize, like our political leaders I'm talking about? And I'm not, I think for some people that it is fear, that they fear consequences if they denounce Israel's apartheid, genocidal politics. But I think for a lot of people, they actually think that that's fine, and that because that's the system that they grew up with and that they know and that they benefit from. Mm.
And what about the mood in academia? What's your take on that? Like in relation with all these, we are living through this age of hyper-imperialism. You mentioned how Mark Carney, he didn't mention anything about, yeah, this current war. In fact, they all join hands with the kind of the US agenda in some ways. I see some, breaks in that consensus,
Mm.
like including Spain coming out against it, but also France not allowing the United States to use its airspace to conduct strikes against Iran. But yeah, we have been living through this moment of kind of increased live streamed. I don't know if it's increased, like, Kieran mentioned, there's so many million people have died because of US imperialism since World War II. I mean, there was a study that said that, I don't know, 38 million people died due to unilateral sanctions since the 1970s till today by the United States and its allies. So there are some fractures happening. What is the mood in academia? You're in international relations and political science. Is there that lack of courage that you mentioned about the political establishment in the in
Oh,
academia?
always. I mean, I think one of the hallmarks of academia is a lack of courage. A lot of a lot of words, a lot of big words, and a lot of very little action, especially in times when it's desperately needed. There was recently at the International Studies Association AGM, so that's the biggest association for international relations scholars. It's based in the US. The conferences are always in the US or Canada. Very strange events, but I have been to many of them over my time. And there was a BDS motion on the agenda this year, which was defeated. The politics within the governing council of the ISA is really fraught over this, but
Wow.
the interests of the American Israeli interests are very strong and well represented in that. And so the latest update from that was where my personal response is like I'm not going to be a member of the ISA. Why do we have to stay attached to these organizations? It doesn't make any sense to me. Like I won't go to their conference. So what? It's like big deal. So now people are starting to think, do we boycott ISA? Do we withdraw our membership? Do we form an alternative organization? It's like, yes to all of those things, like it's people get very wedded to status and to those kinds of weird institutions within academia, as well as, that's academia itself, right? But yeah, so it's, I don't know if there's a general mood within academia that I could describe. People are obviously aware that bad things are happening, and some people are responding to that in a positive way. But for most people, I don't know, not that much.
You talked earlier about the pointillistic empire, and I kind of think that the military bases are just the tip of the iceberg of something that there are so many institutions which are beholden to the US in some way or have some
Mm.
allegiance to it built into the structure of the institution. And I think that is the primary way in which they control the world is through controlling the way people view the world.
That's right. And I
Narratives.
think I've been thinking a lot about that recently because, and as Josephine said, I think US soft power in terms of international relations and diplomacy is in a very dire state. I don't think many countries in the world take America very seriously, even the ones that are close to it. I think people And I know people who've been quite wedded to the idea of America as being, we need America, who would now no longer think that. And that's happened quite quickly over the last couple of years. So I think on that official level, American soft power is diminished. But then I think about all the way in which young men in particular are influenced by online Christian nationalism and these kinds of currents which manifest themselves. I've got sons and they're fine. But from what I hear, through those channels about what people are thinking, through students as well, um, I think that form of American soft power remains and is real, and it's kind of weirdly anarchical in a sense, and maybe that's reflective of the current administration too. There's this sort of toxic masculinity, definitely this religious dimension to it, but it's also quite unpredictable about how people will take that on board and how that will manifest in society. So I worry about that dimension of American power persisting, that sort of pop culture, online, social media dimension. Even as the influence of the state falls away, that still seems very strong.
It looks like our four ministers on a trip to the United States shortly, going to meet Marco Rubio. What is this going to be about? Is it going to be about, getting New Zealand on board for a ground invasion? We don't know what it's about, but our protest is going to be on the day after he returns, so we will have more details about that, as well as I just also wanted to think about like, okay, so there's a number of countries that are currently kind of saying, no, we don't want to join the war on Iran. This was a mistake. But at the same time, they're not committing their troops, for example, which is a little bit different from the Iraq war, for example, where, Australia was a huge contributor. Are there any updates on that? Like, what's Australia doing? What's the EU's position? Is this going to be a break in the US empire's power, or do you think this whole trend with Mark Carney and also Spain and France and that having some a little bit of voice against the United States, is that a temporary thing? They're just going to wait until Trump leaves office and then it goes back to normal?
I
What do
think
you
that they're
think?
hoping that that will be the case. But I think what's really vital here is how the Gulf states react, and particularly Saudi Arabia. And, Netanyahu and Trump have both been kind of hinting that Saudi Arabia is egging them on to keep attacking Iran, that they want to see this continue, that they want to see Iran wiped out, and which may be the case behind the scenes, but there's no way that the Saudi regime could come out and say that. And so I've said previously on another podcast that I think the undercurrents within Saudi society around this, around Gaza, and the treatment of the Palestinians, around what is happening in Iran. Yeah, watch that space. I don't think that that's as stable a regime as people might like to think.
Uh,
And if they lose
Um,
Saudi Arabia, that's the biggest population amongst those loyal Gulf states. Very hard to see how they could hold on to the other ones if the tide turned in Saudi Arabia. So Yeah.
One of the things, what struck me with Mark Carney in his elbows up moment, where he defied the US, is that it reminded me of times when people like Ferdinand Marcos or Nguyen Cao Ki in Vietnam blustered about the US empire when it was, and it works. I mean, people buy it, but it's clearly a pretense. They are loyal servants of it. And when I those who heard me talking to Sina Rahmani recently, he interrupted me because he objected to what he thought I was suggesting that the GCC countries have some sort of independence they can exercise, that these their governments can actually that they are independent. But I don't necessarily think that the Saudi government has any power, and the idea that the tail wagging the dog here is
Mm.
I think quite wrong. But one of the things that's happening with Iranian resistance is that it does seem to be reigniting a lot of resistance throughout the region. Iraqi resistance fighters are again active against US forces. We saw in Syria that people invaded the UAE embassy because the UAE is seen as the leading Zionist Arab regime. And, in places like Bahrain and so forth, as Sina was pointing out, it's powder keg, perhaps, and as you were talking about with the Maronites now looking at what Israel's doing to their community, is there a chance that there will be a kind of conflagration of resistance that sweeps through West Asia and maybe changes things?
I mean, it's hard. I've given up on the business of prediction. Like, I don't know what's going to happen from hour to
Yeah.
hour, let alone what might happen next week or next month, or particularly tomorrow after the deadline and the potential flow-on consequences from that. So I think anything is possible for the Gulf region. There is obviously a lot of money at stake, and so there's a lot of things that will be very difficult to dislodge that have built themselves up there over the years. But I don't know how they can look at their security situation and think that they've done the right thing up to this point. Like and you're seeing some voices, I think, going in that direction, saying that, that there's a need to fundamentally reconsider what how security is done in that part of the world. And if that means that US bases become less welcome, if less US weapons are being sold to those countries, then maybe it is a moment of significant change.
Yeah.
There will be change. I just don't know what form it's going to take at this point.
Yeah, it does seem like a moment of change. I mean, a lot of people, especially people with anti-imperialist kind of focus, which looks at, United States as the imperial hegemon, not the Western leftists who talk about equal multiple imperialisms, but the ones that actually recognize the US as this, with all its um, infrastructure that you were talking about, but also its financial dominance on the world. How Iran's actions are actually disempowering, significantly, have the potential of disempowering the United States significantly, including, the Strait of Hormuz and the exchange of money going there in yuan and in
Mm.
rials, which is a threat to the dollar dominance, which is one of the key aspects of the U.S. empire strength. So, and also, keeping those U.S. bases there becoming increasingly untenable. And you also mentioned about how these family kingdoms are becoming, there's the strength of their powers being questioned at the moment. The people of these regions standing, in solidarity at heart with the Palestinians.
Mm.
And there's this increasingly, many people are talking about this Shia and Sunni coming together in this resistance against US and Israel after watching that live stream genocide for 2.5 years. In Bahrain, of course, there's a big Shia population. In Yemen, of course, there's the Houthis who haven't really leveraged that Red Sea leverage that they have. So it is indeed, an interesting, time to analyze these shifts, but also a very terrifying moment because we are probably much closer to a nuclear catastrophe than we were ever before. So
Mm.
yeah, ultimately, we are having this rally to oppose the power of the U.S. empire. So, what is, in your view, what can we do in New Zealand to oppose all these things from happening? What can we do as just individuals here?
Well, I mean, I said before, we've all seen how our political leaders and the media are unwilling to rise to the occasion. And even if you frame that in terms of just applying equal standards of criticism to, say, Russia as you would to the United States, like even if that was the bar, criticize Trump in the same, talk about Trump in the same way as you talk about Putin, talk about even that is not, it seems to be completely impossible for our political leaders and for our media to think about making that kind of comparison, even when the behavior of the United States is so out there, so obvious in rhetoric and in action. So failing that, it becomes up to us. It becomes up to us to respond. Like
Yeah,
it's not, we're not going to get leadership from our mainstream media sources or from our political leaders on it. Certainly not the mainstream political parties. So if we are unhappy with what we are seeing in the world, and we certainly should be unhappy with what we are seeing in the world, we have to find other ways to express that dissatisfaction. And that may be for some people engaging on social media. For some people, it may be, and I think it should be, getting out on the streets and putting yourself out there and showing physically that you are aligned with a people and hopefully an increasingly growing number of people who are opposed to these developments, to where we are in history at the moment, and demand something different. And it always feels frustrating, and always is going to feel like you're not making progress, that you don't get reported on, that you don't get favorable support from political leaders when you do these things. But there are actually quite few things that we can do. But standing in solidarity with people who feel the same way is really, I think, remains the main way in which we can express our dissatisfaction with things.
So yeah, as W.E.B. Du Bois said, power concedes nothing without a demand. And I was lucky enough to be talking to John Minto this morning about this sort of thing. He's reflecting on the things where the times when we have succeeded shifting government policy, and it's a distant memory for us, and younger people wouldn't even understand that concept, but we do need to get back to that point. And the first thing is visibility and presence. It's the building block. It's not enough. There's so much else that needs to be done. And the problem with social media, I mean, it is good, but it by its nature limited. As soon as it starts to have an effect, the levers are there for it to be shut down. So being in the streets is essential. Making yourself visible and heard, and taking a stand, committing to it, and saying, I am going to do this. So that's what we're hoping to achieve or to start this weekend, because this is the beginning of something,
yeah.
and we will be moving on from there.
Yeah, and in my view, one of the goals that we can have while we are trying to fight the system, which is, profiting from war, profiting from genocide, profiting from, disease, the pharma corporations and that, experimenting weapons on civilian populations. So if we really want to destroy the system, I think, I like this framework of looking at imperialism as a system so the global imperial system, and New Zealand is actually a part of that US empire through various ways. Number one, we are part of Five Eyes. We are part of, we have a new FBI office in Wellington, which was opened last year. We have all these kind of links. We've got this base. It's supposedly an Antarctic research base, but about 1/3 or 1/4 of the traffic there is US military related. So we're very much linked to the US empire. And one way we can weaken this empire, with which is, such a deadly empire as we can see it, is to cut ties with the US empire. Obviously, there's the economic ties through BDS and that, but also as a nation, cutting ties with the US and forming an independent foreign policy. This is something that we can aim in the short term to mobilize for. And that's one of the things that we will be fighting for in our rally on the 11th of April. It is, us against this permanent war economy that the United States military industrial complex has promoted, right? It's an area that they have been profiting from so much, right? So even when children are dying in Gaza, you can see the stock prices for arms industries going up. This is such an inhumane system. It's going to, destroy people and the planet. The climate catastrophe is here, so it's not really a choice to stay at home. We have to make our presence felt against this empire, because this is a fight for survival of humanity. So yeah, one small step to get there is to cut ties with the US empire. And when New Zealand cuts ties from the US empire, that necklace of imperialism, we cut out one bead from it, and that will be a blow to the empire. And I think that's one thing that we can achieve through organizing.
Right, so I think we'll maybe draw it to a conclusion soon. So before I ask for last thoughts, firstly, I want to say that I've just been reading a book about Puerto Rico, and the FBI was crucial in destroying the independence movement there. So having an FBI office in the country is not a good thing. So before we finish, just a reminder, so in Poneke, Wellington, there is a rally starting at 11 a.m. at Civic Square, and I believe they'll be marching to Parliament. And in Tamaki Makaurau, it is at 2 p.m. at Aotea Square. And here in Otatahi, it is at 1 p.m. at the Bridge of Remembrance. So, and again, for those of you who live in other centres, do keep your ears and eyes out, or just organise something yourself. Get out into the streets. Just do it on the spur of the moment. Run around, yell, scream, make yourself heard. All right, so now, so before I go to you, Jeremy, are there any last thoughts from you, Josephine?
Yes, absolutely. So my last thought is this. Our every action should be a battle cry against the biggest threat to humanity at the moment, to people and the planet, which is the US empire. This US empire has, very powerful, but its domestic and foreign policy are not determined by the people, by the working class in the United States. It's been captured by the United States, a very small minority of people who own a lot of wealth, right? The top 1% of the world, they own 43% of the wealth in this country, and they are often the ones that call the shots in terms of the global imperial system and its policies. So our every action should be a battle cry against the system, which is a threat to people and the planet. And these words are from Che Guevara, and those are my concluding thoughts. Come along, contribute in whatever way you can to dismantling the system which is threatening our futures.
And Jeremy.
Yeah, well, I spent some time in Taiwan last year, and I've been doing some research and writing and interviews on about peace activism in Taiwan, where the issues and the threats of war are much, much more live for them than they are for many other people around the world. Likewise, the people in Okinawa, where they house the US bases that are being expanded. And as we can see from the war with Iran, we know that a war between the US and China means an attack on Okinawa would likely be the first thing that would happen in terms of Chinese strategy to take out that major US base. Likewise, the bases in Korea and Japan and elsewhere in the region. So that whole idea of the island chains and the defense of the United States is really tied up in all of those places. And it's really hard for them in that context, because when you're threatened by war in that way, in that sort of daily basis, politics does become very polarized, and peace activism becomes stigmatized and kind of taboo in some ways. If you speak out against the possibility of war between China and Taiwan, you can quickly be labeled Chinese sympathizer. This process of red tagging and so on. So it's I think a very common situation that in the places which need peace activism the most, it's the hardest to do because of the politics that are creating that conflict that might lead to violence. And that's certainly the case in Taiwan. But what we are seeing in the mainstream politics in Taiwan is some pretty significant shifts at the moment. I was going to mention this just before. The current chairperson of the KMT, the Kuomintang, currently in opposition, but yeah, Chung Li-won, is taking a delegation to China to meet Xi Jinping this week, in fact. So the KMT, oddly enough, has become the party of cross-strait reconciliation and dialogue, as opposed to the Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP, which is much more aligned with the United States and focused on militarization and missile shields and all of this kind of stuff. So amidst all of that sort of high politics, the situation in a place like Taiwan is much more complex and much more contested than we might see from the outside. And so I think for us to understand that and to recognize that in all of these places there is resistance to militarization, there is resistance to the consequences for people of military bases, of military spending, of the threat of war. People will get out on the streets, even in really difficult situations, and they will do that with great patience and persistence. And often it's a process that takes decades and might ultimately fail as well. But this is important work, I think, for humans to do, for humanity, to maintain that kind of anti-war, anti-militarization politics. Even when you feel like it's failing, I think it's a fight that you have to keep fighting. And I've met a lot of people in Taiwan and elsewhere who are doing that kind of work. So it's very inspiring.
Well, that is awesome. Yep. And, maybe they can, the KMT and the Chinese government can unite in the spirit of Sun Yat-sen and,
That's the idea.
And people who have military bases in their backyards the world over experience something very much like good old-fashioned imperialism, and of course it's environmentally destructive. They don't have sovereignty and so forth. I just would like to thank you both, and I'll just say to listeners, we didn't even talk about the Epstein class or anything like that. And there's probably we could have gone on for hours and hours and hours, but we're going to spare you that. So thank you, Jeremy, and I hope you have a very good week. And thank you, Josephine. And thank you all for listening. Like, share, and subscribe, and indeed do Patreon if you feel inclined to do that too.
If
artificers are denied, living a pointless life, but learning all your lessons. Fucking politics, there's no distinction. The road's upon now. It's paved with good intentions, and I'll admit that I'm at a loss for what to say when they quote this as a cost we ought to stay. I live amongst the people every day in this vindictive, forgetful fucking rain. It feels like we're on the road to hell.